Well, Heather, here we are with Module 2.
Yes.
And as always, I'm excited. I'm excited for people to see this. In the first module, we were introduced to the why, the what, and the how.
Yes.
Right? And the why is a big deal because too often we stick with the how. We start arguing over the how in so many areas of life, but we don't really have an understanding of why we do this or why, as Christians, we are called to be generous.
Yes.
And we talk about redeeming why we give, which is, again, what a great title. And so now on Module 2, where do we go from creation? The first was creation and how we're created. What is the mandate? What are the directions that God has given us?
Right.
But now we come to this module. What are we to look for?
Okay, so the first module was really kind of focused on humans in general, like what are we here for? You know, why are we here? What are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to do it? God gives us some clear direction, right? He says, you're made in my image. And so it was really kind of focused on us. And then, you know, the little apple incident that occurred kind of changed
There's a little apple on your graphic.
Yeah, a little apple that we all carry with us
Yeah.
in our lives, right? That apple in our mind is there with us always. We're aware of it.
Yeah.
So we had this opportunity to realize, oh, the trajectory has changed, yet God's blessing never changed.
Right.
And so now we're moving into recollecting. We're going to look back at what people did in the Old Testament. How did this shape out, right? How did this come to be?
Right, giving isn't just about the New Testament church.
No.
Right? God's people have always needed to give. There's always been a motivation to give, and so we should be able to see it out, played out in the hearts of God's people in the Old Testament and in Abraham and the nation of Israel. So how do we see that?
First, it starts with this understanding that the people of Israel, they just understood deeply this concept of creation, okay? That creation had this order to it, that God was in the business of putting things in order. So creation had an order, animals had an order, humans had an order, and that humans were a little bit different because we had this whole image of God thing going on, right? And we covered that in Module 1. But now in Module 2, it's like, okay, what did that actually look like? And so their why was rooted in this understanding that God is creator and we are created. We are creature. And we rely upon God to care for us, to give us the seeds to grow so we can get the harvest, right? And then we get into this what of, you know, what did they do? What did they give? Well, they gave of their first and best. You know, and then we get into the how, which gets a little complicated. And I tried to simplify it as much as possible. But, you know, there's a richness to understanding that generosity and giving was part of this, again, reciprocal relationship with God.
Right. It didn't just narrow down to, you know, what did they bring to the temple and throw into the temple offering plate.
Right.
You know, it was really about being generous with their whole being. I mean, putting their time and efforts into their fields, into their crops, into their herds in order to have the first fruits.
Yes.
And have those be the best.
Yes.
They invested themselves in responding to God's generosity so they could turn around and be generous back to him.
Yes, and then God honored, God blesses that, right?
Right.
So there was something with the first and best there was a sweetness to giving back to God. Not that God needed the harvest, right?
No.
But that's not what the purpose was.
Right.
The purpose was this beautiful mutual benefit that God would say, oh, you brought that to me, how wonderful. No different than a parent and a little child comes and brings what they made in kindergarten.
Yeah, I have a lot of those pieces still tucked away.
A parent's heart, right? And so they understood that they had this intimate relationship with God and that their giving was born out of that. And definitely God intends for that to show up in our human relationships as well.
Yeah.
And how we show up in the world.
And And of course, we've read the story before. It didn't quite play out as
Nope.
intended
Nope.
because that apple's still there.
Apple
We'll
incident.
see a little bit about that, and
Yep.
that affects us even today. But by God's grace, He still comes through with His promise, His covenantal promises that we see played out in His generosity. Well, I'm excited for you all to see this and to glean from it. We hope you enjoy it. We also would love to hear back from you, what your feedback is or how this is impacting you. So here we go.
Here we go.
Off to Module 2.
Enjoy. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Redeeming Why We Give. This week, we're diving into Module 2, Recollecting Giving in the Old Testament. But let's take a moment to do a quick review of what we talked about last week. So last week, we started with 3 big questions: why, what, and how. And we talked about that there are those big questions. Why are we here? What are we supposed to do? And how are we going to do it? We then talked about we needed a vibe that kind of went with each one of those questions. And so we said, hey, we're going to gratefully live into our why. And then we're also going to continually clarify our what. And we're going to consistently model our how. Then we talked about we were made in this image of God, and that God's heart was to bring order out of disorder. From the beginning, God's heart is to put things in order. And we were created in God's image. And there's 2 different understandings of the image of God. One was this verbal of how we act, what we do, how we actually show up. And I likened it to a disco globe with a bunch of mirrors on it under a really great big light source. And so we have this light source of God, and we are to reflect God's love wherever we go. Imagine being in a room filled up with a disco globe light show. That's kind of the image I want you to get. And then there's this sense of a noun with regard to the image of God, that we represent God. Like the Statue of Liberty represents freedom, we humans are to represent God, essentially walking around with signs that say, God, we belong to God, we represent God. We are to be God's little representatives in our daily lives, in our regular, ordinary, real life, right? Okay. Then we talked about we were made to do this for fulfilling the big task. That's our what. And the big task is that we are really to be bringing order from disorder, just like God's heart was in the beginning. And so we're called to do that. And how we're going to do it is through St. Gabriel's mission. Now, there was this little apple incident that we had to take a detour on to talk about, but that never got in the way of God's blessing for humans to go and do the big task. That's always been there, and it's always going to be there. So knowing that, reviewing that, I think it's time to go ahead and jump into Module 2, where we're going to take a look back at how people in the Old Testament gave. What was their why? What was their what? And what was their how? I hope you enjoy. I'll see you there. Hey everybody, it's Heather again, and welcome back to Redeeming Why We Give. And we are jumping into Module 2. So we made a couple of adjustments with regard to our modules. So I wanted to update you on that. So our Module 2 originally was going to be a little bit too long. So we wanted to break it up so that you could fully understand what we were sharing with you. We understand that sometimes it's a lot of information, particularly in the Old Testament. There's just a lot of details. And so we decided to break Module 2 into Module 2 and Module 3. So today we're going to be doing Module 2. Next week you will see the second part of the Old Testament with regard to recollecting giving in the Old Testament, and that will be Module 3. So let's jump in to recollecting giving
in the Old Testament. Now, just like we did in Module 1, I'm going to break this down into kind of a question format. The only exception will be Module 3, which will kind of be like a continuation of Module 2. We're going to talk about why people in the Old Testament gave, what they gave, and how they gave. So let's jump in. Why did they give? What did they give? And how did they give? So let's dive into why did they give? So as we learned in Module 1, creation came into being because of a creator. And this particular creator, God, which is represented by this white hand, wants to take this chaos. We learned that in the first sentences of Genesis that the earth was darkness, and some interpretations call it chaos. And God brought order out of chaos. He called it creation. Now, creation exists because of the creator, and this creator wants to make sure everything is in order. So nature itself had its own order. In other words, God does not have to micromanage the grass to grow, the plants to bloom, and the seeds to reproduce. They just seem to know how to do it. Also, God was very keen on, it seems, on having night and day, ordering our days as humans. Next came animals. Again, animals had their own order, and they seemed to know exactly what to do and how to be and how to behave in this creation. And then finally, the pièce de la résistance was humans. And humans too had their own order, male and female. They were made, if you recall, from the last module. The distinction is animals and nature were made and created by God, but humans, as we learned last week, were made in God's image, in his likeness. And this was unique. So there was already this dynamism happening that creation takes on a life of its own for animals and for nature, and humans, remember, have a very specific purpose. They are created in God's image in order to reflect this disco globe here and represent God in the world with a job to bring order out of disorder. And always they carry with them the little apple incident, which is just part of their human existence now, but always a helpful reminder for us to remember our own apple incident thoughts. So considering all of this, their why, the why of the people of the Old Testament was rooted in their understanding of the distinction between created, ed ending, and creator, right? Or ending, which means God is the one that brought all of this together. And there was this sense that early in the Old Testament, we get the understanding that they understood that difference very keenly, and in fact was one of the reasons why giving the first and the best, which we will talk about in just a few minutes, was about this first fruits, was about bringing just the first of the harvest, understanding the harvest would only happen when God created it. So they relied on God to provide for them. And this understanding really drove why they gave, because they understood existence in and of itself meant that this creator deserved honor, deserved maybe a gift, thankfulness, gratitude, right? Okay, so this distinction was really important. Now, there's a term that Father Rob Griffith says all the time: God is God and we are not. And they understood that distinction very keenly. Now, let's talk about what they gave. So this is really tied closely with their why. But what they gave was rooted in their understanding of their relationship with God, and specifically a word, reciprocity. So in a reciprocal relationship, there are two people involved, two groups of people, even in a collective, that have a give and take, that both parts, both sides of the relationship or that connection between those two groups have mutual benefit. So when there is reciprocity, both sides, and in this particular case, God, creator, and the created would receive a mutual benefit of being in relationship with each other. Reciprocity. So I want to draw your attention to this arrow here coming from God, and it has this little heartbeat. That's the love of God. And God desires that all of humanity prosper and fulfill their purpose and have what they need. And then humans are to respond to that heartbeat of God, that love of God, with giving. And they are to give in the context of what they were created for, the disco globe, to reflect and represent God in creation. So giving was rooted in this reciprocal relationship between creator and created, God and humans. Now, I want to break it down a little bit more for you to kind of give you some context to what I mean by a reciprocal relationship, which is give and take. So I want to draw your attention to there's kind of like up and down here where you can see there's arrows down and then arrows up. So the arrows down are coming from God. So God provides life. He provides and gives and sustains life. So one of the first things God does is he creates humans, and he creates them in his image, and he says, I'm going to give what you need and sustain life. So God's provision is, here's creation. The animals know what to do. Nature knows what to do. And humans, I've given you a purpose and I've told you what to do, just like we talked about last week. So understanding God's provision, the first thing we see in the Old Testament is they responded with giving their first and best, grateful for life. They gave of their first and best. Then we see in the Old Testament God's authority, where God offers his wisdom, declaring what is right and good. So God's authority says, I know what is right and good, and I'm going to tell you. And the response of humans was to obey, to therefore be in the safety of God's authority, living right and good, following the pathway. Also, God gave his wisdom. God's wisdom says God knows what humans need for full and healthy lives. And the work of humans is to respond with work and growth, practicing God's plan for full and healthy living. And we might call that spiritual formation, but also discipline and accountability could be considered in here. So I want you to see that there is this give and take where God offers something, humans respond, God offers, humans respond, God offers, humans respond. That is this reciprocal give and take in a relationship where all parties in the relationship, God and humans, receive mutual benefit of that reciprocal relationship. Now, last, this is the complicated part, and I want to remind you, we are going to get through part of it, and then we're going to pick up the rest in the next module 3. So let's dive into how they gave. So remember, there is this reciprocal understanding of God providing for creation and humanity, and humans dictated here by the pink arrow. This is how they respond, okay? So in this reciprocal relationship between God and humans, God says, I'm going to create a structure so that God and humans can be together on earth. I want you to think back to the first module. Imagine the Garden of Eden. Early in Genesis, humans and God walked in the garden together until the apple incident. And the apple incident brought sin into the human experience, which then separated humans from God. So, in this way, the tabernacle is this place where God's presence is on earth and humans meet God there. So, God says, build this tabernacle, and the way you're going to manage it, humans, my created beloved humans, is through leadership. There's going to be priests who perform rituals and sacrifices and worship in this temple on behalf of humanity to God. So you see here, here's the tabernacle. God in his heartbeat says, I'm going to provide leadership for you. This leadership then takes these gifts, these offerings, which I'm going to break down in a minute, and gives them back to God to honor God for what God has given them. So seeing that connection and seeing how that works, this structure created an opportunity, created a system that enabled humans to accomplish the big task we talked about in the last module. So let's talk about the structure. I'm going to break it down a little bit, and hopefully you'll follow along with me. Again, if you need to watch portions of this video again to kind of grasp what I'm saying, feel free to hit pause and watch as many times as it takes. And also happy to give you feedback. I'm happy to give you answers and talk with you and discuss some of these more complicated factors. So let's talk about this structure that was part of the giving. Just like in the last slide, God created the temple and he empowered leaders to help humans respond to God in that beautiful give and take reciprocal relationship. So here we have that part of the structure of giving was rituals. And the folks that were involved in overseeing those rituals, we know, the priests. These were these folks that were raised up by God from the tribe of Levi, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later. But these were the folks that were the priests in the community of Israel. And there were three things that they focused on regarding rituals. The first was sacrificial offerings, which was maintaining and restoring their relationship with God. It was kind of their way of giving their first and best to God through these offerings. Then there's the festivals and the feasts. This is where they celebrated their relationship with God with gratitude, remembrance, and remembering the promises that God made to Israel and Israel also made to God. And here, that is where they kind of honor their safety and obedience. That's their response to God, what God has given them. And then last is the covenants. Now, the covenants aren't so much a ritual, but they were a rich, rich part of them understanding the terms of their relationship with God. And that is how spiritual growth and their work and growth was their work to bring to God, to honor God by really honoring and being responsible with what they agreed to in their relationship with God. So, considering those three things, let's take a look at sacrificial offerings. So, this is just a few of the sacrificial offerings that Israel would participate in. And I want to talk real quick about the fact that, yes, these sacrificial offerings were central to how they gave as individuals and a community, and again, is how they maintained and restored the relationship between them and God. So let's look here first. First and best. Remember, we talked about they gave their first and best in response to God's provision? Well, one of the ways in which they honored this was offering a burnt offering. And this was consumed by fire on the altar, and it symbolized complete dedication to God. And they also offered grain. This would be a mixture of flour, oil, and frankincense, expressing gratitude for God's provision. So you can see right there how their first and best would align with this dedication to God, that they're bringing this offering to God, and also that they would bring grain in gratitude for God's provision. Now let's look at safety and obedience. One of the offerings they would participate in is peace. This peace offering was a celebration and a thanksgiving where part of the offering would be burnt and then it would be shared amongst the entire community. So everyone got to participate in this peace offering where they could celebrate their obedience to God and also their safety in knowing God was going to provide for them. And then last, with regard to work and growth, their response to God's provision and care was their work and growth was to recognize that the whole Apple incident was a part of their world. And so one of the offerings they would bring is a sin offering. And this sin offering was for unintentional sins, and it would be the slaughter of an animal, and then blood would be literally sprayed onto the altar. Then there was the guilt offering. Now, this was different from the sin offering. The sin offering was for unintentional sins. The guilt offering was for specific offenses, which required restitution with the slaughter of a ram, and then making restitution with the person that was wounded or betrayed or harmed. So that was their work and growth. So you can see right here, just in these few offerings, that it captured that these offerings were literally a response to what God had asked them to do. First and best, safety and obedience, and their work and growth. Now, let's talk about festivals and feasts. So festivals and feasts, I do want you to visualize like a party. So the calendar of festivals and feasts includes many that I do not have pictured here. I just wanted to capture the top 4 that are going to align with what we're talking about with regard to giving in the Old Testament. But the calendar of feasts and festivals is plentiful, and there's just so much that you can dive into. And this will be provided in the backup so you can go and take a look at those slides to really dive into the rest of the festivals and feasts throughout the year. Now, these are again central to the community, and it's how they celebrate their relationship with God, really focused on gratitude, remembrance, and covenantal promises. So first, I want to show you about the Passover. That's very familiar to us. We understand that the Passover is remembrance of the escape from slavery in Egypt, and it occurred on the 14th day of Nisan, which is the period between March and April. Now, right after Passover, following Sabbath, there is a feast of first fruits, and this marks the beginning of the harvest. So this is their very first way to say the harvest has come in. We're going to get our first and best, and we're going to bring it to the festival, and we're going to offer this to God because we are going to celebrate that we have this harvest and we have what we need to support our community and our family and our loved ones, and we are going to say thank you, God, and celebrate. That celebration was then followed by 50 days after the Feast of First Fruits is the Feast of Weeks, also known as Pentecost. Sounds really familiar to something we celebrate in the Christian faith. But Pentecost was actually at the end of the harvest, and it was a remembering of the giving of the law at Sinai. Now, in just a minute, I'm going to talk about the covenants. But the law at Sinai was given through Moses. And most of us kind of at least remember a little bit about what Moses did. But what was key about Pentecost was this was God's way of saying, I'm giving you the law so that you would know in the 10 Commandments how to love God and love one another. So 50 days after first fruits of saying the harvest has begun, then they celebrate God's law that teaches them how to love God and each other at the Feast of Weeks at the end of the harvest. And then last, the 15th to the 22nd day of Tishrei, which is the period of September to October, this is also known as the Feast of Booths. It's called the Feast of Tabernacles, and it's a joyful festival of thanksgiving for God's provision. And it also is a remembrance of their 40 years of wandering in the desert, so they all sleep in temporary booths to celebrate and honor God. This was all a part of them responding with their first and best, as you can see in the Feast of First Fruits, living into that understanding of their obedience and safety in God's provision with regard to the Feast of Weeks and the law at Sinai and the celebration of the end of the harvest, and then their work and growth to know that they had to lean in to give of their first fruits, but also celebrate what God had provided for them in remembering the 40 years of wandering in the desert where they received the law, but also had to stay obedient and follow God regardless of the circumstances. And then finally, the covenants. So the covenants are a little unique because they're really not a ritual, but they are such an integral part of the Israel community. So the covenants were God's promises to his people, and he made these promises through key people in the Old Testament. So the covenants are central to why and what of how they gave, because it was like the core promises that connected them with God in relationship. And this is how they remember and honor the terms of those relationships. So here's Noah. We recognize Noah. We remember maybe or when we had young children and we told them the story of Noah and the ark and the animals. But the real deal with Noah is God really made a commitment to preserve life. And this applies to all humanity, that marked a new beginning between God and humans after the flood. And this is where humans had also begun responding to God with their first and best. It's where we see in the early books of the Old Testament that this first and best started showing up. Then there was Abraham, and Abraham was blessed by God to have descendants, land, and generational blessings. And this Abraham story was foundational to the basis of Israel's identity as a nation. And their response would have been of staying obedient to God's law, to what God had asked them to do, so that they could experience and enjoy the safety of God's care, compassion, love, and provision in that reciprocal relationship with God. Then we have Moses, which I mentioned just a minute ago. And in the covenant with Moses, there was a legal and moral structure that was created. So that's the temple and the priests. And this is where people were to remain obedient to God, where he would provide his law. This is where he would say God's authority in saying what is right and good. And it was grounded in their relationship with God. And this is where they would respond with their work and growth, the work they needed to do in order to follow God's law, to love God and love one another in accordance with what Moses told them in the Ten Commandments. And then last we have David. David is unique because David is a manifestation of a kingdom that is foreshadowing a kingdom of God. And it's this person of David that comes with a promise of a savior, that God would send a savior through this line of David. Okay, I want to take a pause here because part of how they gave was something called the tithe. Now, tithing is something we hear in the Christian church, but it's important to understand where the tithe came from, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit, and then it's going to come up later in Module 4 when we dive into the New Testament. So the story of the tithe started with what God offered a guy named Abram, who was soon to be named Abraham. And there was a guy named Melchizedek who was a king and a priest. And he was a king and a priest of the God Most High. And this king and priest, Melchizedek, blessed Abram. And Abram responded by giving a tenth of everything he had. Then later on in Genesis, God promises Jacob in a vision of a stairway to heaven. Jacob wakes up and promises to give God a tenth of everything that God provided him, as long as God would be with him and protect him. And then God instructs Moses on a framework for giving. And this framework included 3 types of tithes. They would give a tenth of the results of their labors, the first and best, to support the Levite tribe. Now, the Levite tribe, what's important to understand here is of the 12 tribes of Israel, the Levites were the only ones who were not given land in order to live on and to grow their food. So they had no place to live and they had no way to support or sustain themselves by planting their own food. So the tenth was to go to support the Levite tribe, who, yes, were the priests caring for the temple. The second tithe was to support of the feasts and festivals. And the feasts and festivals were an integral part of the community that every single person in the community would participate in, regardless of their status, regardless of their income level, regardless of whether they had a home or were homeless. The goal was for all of Israel to participate in the celebration of the feasts and the festivals to honor God. And the third tithe was to support the poor and the needy so they could have the resources they need to have a full and healthy life. So you can see here that Abraham, Jacob, and Moses were the key stories that began the story of the tithe. And the tithe was not so much about the individual. The tithe was focused on the community to support the priesthood, to participate as a community in festivals and feasts, and to care for the charity and social welfare of those who did not have the resources to get what they needed. So that's the story of the tithe. So here is a summary of the formula on giving in the Old Testament. Why did they give? They were grateful for the gift of life and sustenance, a reciprocal relationship between them and God. What did they give? They offered their first and best of labor. The why eclipsed the what. And then how did they give? Structure enabled that giving with the tabernacle, the priesthood, the offerings, and the festivals. Yet, something was off, and the formula ran into a bit of a roadblock. And that's where we're going to pause today, and we will jump back in next week so that we can talk through the roadblock with regard to the formula of giving in the Old Testament. What went wrong? That's what we're going to talk about next week. See ya. Have a great week. Bye.